So with that, I want to turn it over to John Michael and let him give kind of an update on what's going on in the county. John, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I think most of you all know me. I'm John Michael with Hanson. Used to be Naismith Engineering for many years, and we've been Hanson now for 9 years. I was going to quit working 4 years ago, and I'm still working. But I love what I'm doing. So there's not a lot of good things with getting old. You know, you can't grow hair anymore. You can't see. You got hearing aids. But you do gain institutional knowledge over time. And I've been practicing engineering here now for 44 years. I moved here in 1982, went to work for Jim Naismith, and got immersed into the water business immediately because Jim was very actively involved in all aspects of water, particularly here in Sampat County. He and his father, for all practical purposes, built the Sampat Municipal Water District. And so I got to work on those facilities very early on in my career, you know, starting back in 1982. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some history. Randy's heard this, Kathy's heard this, I know Brian's heard this, but I'm going to take you through kind of a history of progression over the last 40 years to show you how we got where we are, because I think it'll all make sense at the end, because we have lots of options. You know, the good thing about being here is we do have options. It's a function of which trigger do you pull first. You know, water supply planning is it's a three-legged stool. It's pretty simple. Is it safe? Is it reliable? And is it affordable? And it's that affordability that is probably the hardest of the boxes to check off, because you can make anything reliable and you can make anything safe. It's just a function of how much is it going to cost. So let's start back in 1982. This is my fourth drought, and they're no fun. Comes with a lot of anxiety. Mother Nature never tells you when the drought's going to start. She doesn't tell you when it's going to end. And the bad thing about the drought that we're in right now, it's by far the worst I've lived through, with no end in sight. And what compounded the problem was we added a lot of demand to our system without replacing supply. So we have everything working against us, you know, going into where we are today. And as I said, we have options. We've got to get some of them moving pretty quick. We have both short-term, mid-term, and long-term options that will allow this area to grow, but we've got to start moving on them. So as I said, this is my fourth drought. When I started with Jim Naismith, one of the first things I got to do was go to Choke Canyon Reservoir for the ribbon cutting of the dam. They had just finished the construction, and there was no water in it. And what I didn't realize at the time is that we were going into a drought in 1982. I just didn't know it. Well, none of us really knew it, but they finished the dam. So our community, all of our region, was surviving off of one reservoir, Lake Mathis. Everything was Lake Mathis. So the city of Sinton at that time, Walter Hill was the city manager, hired Jim and I to help them in 1983 to rebuild their water supply system. They had old wells that were left over from the 40s and 50s that had just lived their life. They were no good. Their pump stations were bad. And so we put together a plan, and the plan was to drill 3 new water wells, 2 of which would be on Welder property, which was Robin Bessie Welder Park, that was donated to the city for park purposes. We had to get permission from the Welder family to drill those wells for Sinton's use for a future water supply. And then we drilled another well across the street. Our groundwater hydrologist was a guy named Steve Reed, Ed L. Reed and Associates. You probably remember that name, right? He was really good, probably knew more about groundwater hydrology than anybody in this region. And Steve was our hydrologist when we drilled the wells in Sinton. And I got to sit on the rig and do the logging of that well, and Steve showed me how to pick out the sands, where the good sands were, where the bad sands were. I was so impressed, I went home and told my wife what I got to do that day, and she's a petroleum engineer, and she just laughed at me. She said, I do that every day with oil. So I learned a lot through that exercise in Sinton. What I learned, the most important thing I learned, is there was good groundwater quality right here in Sampat County. So that was in '83. We finished the first well, and then we took 5 years. We drilled 2 additional wells and replaced the pump station. Then we drilled Judge Edmondson, some of you all might remember him, he got a grant to put a water system in for the community of Edroy. So Steve and I went over there and drilled 2 wells in Edroy and built a water system for them. Again, pretty good groundwater, not as good a groundwater as Sinton, but it was pretty good. Well, the drought started to deepen. In 1984, the alarm bells started going off. We got to a point where we were looking down the chute of literally running out of water, kind of like where we're at today. And it was so serious that we thought maybe we had 6 months of water supply. Luther Jones was the mayor, Ed Martin was our city manager, and they tasked Hayden Head and Judge Woods to go figure out how we were going to get through this crisis. Jim Naismith was in charge of the technical activities working with Gene Urban, and of course I was working on the project with Jim, trying to figure out how do we replumb this system to get water so that Corpus Christi and its region could stay alive. Everything was on the table. We looked at reactivating Kingsville wells. They had just built the South Texas Water Authority line, the 42-inch line that takes water down to Driscoll and Bishop and Kingsville. We were looking at reactivating old wells in Kingsville, sending them back to Corpus Christi to keep industry alive. We were looking at Taft's old wells. Could we reactivate them, put them into the Sampat Water District distribution system? We looked at everything. And at the end of the day, what we decided to do was just start poking holes in the ground along the Nueces River, because we knew that there was water along the river, and the further you got up towards the dam, the better the water quality. And so we reactivated some of the old city wells that were both upstream of Lake Mathis and downstream, and we drilled 8 new stainless steel wells, 800 feet deep. Each one of those wells produced 1 million gallons a day of water, and we just literally dumped it into the river. And we were going to continue to drill wells until the drought ended, because that was really our only option. The city had entered into agreements with the Welder family to negotiate acquiring water rights on the Welder property north of Sinton, which is what we call the Evangeline now. But we didn't have enough time to be able to plumb that up and get it into the Sampat Water District system, because it would have taken a lot of time to get that done. The water was there, you just had to get it into the system. So we focused on drilling wells on the Nueces River. Well, the drought ended, I want to say 87, 88. We had a big flood, filled Choke Canyon, filled Lake Mathis, and we got through it. We didn't have to drill any more wells. Those wells got put into a maintenance program at the city that would allow us to use them at some point in the future. The city maintained those wells all the way up to the mid-90s, and then they just let the leases go. And by the way, the lawyer we worked with to get the leases was Steve Ellis. He was his first job with the Clayburgh Law Firm from Portland, Texas. He wrote those leases with those landowners along the Nueces River that allowed us to drill wells on their property to keep this community alive. So we got through the 80s, and we get into the 90s. EPA had just unleashed the new stormwater regulations on all the municipalities in the country. And Juan Garza was our city manager. Jesus Garza was the assistant city manager. They hired a guy named James Dodson to manage the EPA verdict with all these new stormwater regulations. So James got us through that. Well, in the early 80s and 90s, we had a very strong, Randy, is there any water, like a bottle of water? Because I can tell I'm going to get dry here. So we had a very strong environmental community. The Sierra Club was very strong, Pat Suter, and it was very hard to disseminate the environmental community from the Taxpayers Association. It was kind of one and the same, but they were powerful. And if you couldn't get their blessing on something, it probably just wasn't going to happen, right? So the agreed order, there was a lawsuit filed because when they built Choke Canyon, they did not settle with the environmental community the freshwater inflows to the basin estuaries. So James went from stormwater to go negotiate a settlement which we call now the agreed order, right? So that when we have times of plenty, we're releasing water out of our dams for environmental flows. And then we have there was a prescriptive, calculated way that was to be done. And then we also got credit for wastewater flows that went back into the bay. And so that's enough that we need to know now. And by the way, don't get hung up with dates and times, and I'm going to get you in the ballpark with all this stuff, and it'll make sense. So we go into another drought. Now, Choke Canyon had been full, and Lake Mathis had been full. We added some demand to the system, not a lot, but we had added some demand to the system. But we started going into a drought, and it was a pretty tough drought. Industry could see it very early on. They knew that we were going to be in trouble. The state of Texas started what was called and I'll hold it up. I'm a show and tell kind of guy. The state of Texas funded a program which was called the Trans-Texas Program, which is now kind of morphed into the Region N plan. But this was the first effort to get communities to start looking down the road at all of their alternative water supplies. And I can assure you, there is nothing you can dream up today that we didn't look at in the 90s drought, because it's all in this document right here. And one of those was Evangeline drought water. We talked about desal. We talked about all that stuff. Mary Rhodes was our mayor at the time, and the drought continued to deepen. Mary Rhodes was smart. She formed a mayor's task force for water supply, and that task force included players and customers from the water system from all over the region. Portland had a representative on there, industry had representatives, the Sierra Club had representatives. It was a very inclusive effort that vetted that Trans-Texas Water Program. And out of that program, the number one project that the committee decided was the Mary Rhodes Pipeline. Desal, and I brought the desal report, both the one done in the 80s and the one I did in 94. I made a presentation to the city council about desalination. And remember that three-legged stool? Well, my bottom line to the council was, yeah, it works. Technology's getting better. We can't afford it. It's not there yet. We got other alternatives we can look at. And the one that rose to the top was, let's go get water rights from Lake Texana. James Dodds had led that whole effort. We looked at getting water supply from Garwood. That took an interbasin transfer. That was a monumental thing to get done. I think it might have been the first one in the state of Texas ever to have gotten done. James led that whole effort. And some of you might remember James Dodson. He was the water czar, right? He was the water czar. And James is still a good friend. I rely on him for information all the time, because when he left the city, he took everything with him, kind of like Donald Trump when he left the White House. He has everything. So if I need some history on water, I just call James, and he'll send it to me. So that drought got tough. We put to the vote of the people to build the Mary Rhodes Pipeline, and it didn't pass. Well, that didn't solve our problem. And Mary Rhodes was a strong-willed woman, even though she got elected by the environmental community and the Taxpayers Association. But she knew that we needed to be proactive and we needed to get this done. So the city asked the port to help get the Mary Rhodes Pipeline permitted, designed, and built. We felt like we had about an 18-month window or curtailment was going to start happening. Frank Brogan at the port took a year and a half off of his life and did nothing but manage the building of the Mary Rhodes Pipeline. HDR was the engineer of record for the project. They split it up amongst 3 engineering firms. We did the section from Owen Stevens to Woodsboro Pump Station. Urban did Woodsboro to Bloomington, and I think Govan or Goldston did the last section to Mary Rhodes Pipeline, and then HDR did the pump stations. So we had a bunch of firms that were all coming together because we had 18 months to literally acquire the right-of-way, get it all permitted, and get it built. And Frank got it done. It was miraculous, and thank God, because that's what we're surviving off of today. So that got us through the drought of the 90s. Well, then we went into a period, you know, it's easy to manage a city when you're not growing, right? All you got to do is maintain everything. But when you're growing, it gets a little tougher. Well, from the late 90s, we finished Mary Roads Pipeline in 1997. And we really didn't see growth until the effects of the Eagle Ford Shale. So we went through about a 15-year period where really all we had to do was maintain things. And what happens when you have to just maintain things? You let your guard down. And what happened is we dropped our water wells along the river. We gave up the leases, which we should have always maintained. And by the way, what's up on the screen is our regional water supply system. We'll get to that here in a minute. So the Mary Roads Pipeline was built. We went into a maintenance mode. The state of Texas knew that we were going to have water supply problems because the state was growing. Even though we weren't growing, the rest of the state was growing, right? So Governor Perry and the Water Development Board funded 2 studies to look at where to locate a desalination facility. Where was the best place to locate a desalination facility in the state of Texas? And the end result was 2 locations, one in the valley and Barney Davis Power Plant. CPL owned the plant at the time, but it had all the attributes you wanted. It had land, it had power, it had an intake structure of 500 million gallons a day. It's the closest location to the Gulf of Mexico. If you have to discharge it, had everything. Those studies got put on the shelf because we weren't growing, right? We didn't need to spend the kind of money that it would take to get that done. So we got through about, and there's some things that happened in between there, but we get to about, well, let's just start with the drought of 2011, all right? You know, with the economy went off the cliff in 2007, 2008. We weren't growing. Everybody was just kind of holding on, praying that we would get the economy turned around. Well, during that period of time, the Eagle Ford Shale was found. Remember that guy, Steve Ellis, I was talking about? He told me about it before anybody knew about it because he worked on all those leases. I just didn't know that what he was telling me was going to change my life. It was going to change all of our lives here in South Texas, and it still is. It just morphed into the Permian and, you know, horizontal fracking and all the things that have come from that. So we were all of a sudden starting to see an interest in bringing large-scale industry back to Corpus. We hadn't seen that in a long time. We weren't growing from a municipal standpoint. Even Portland, I saw your graph. You really weren't growing until we hit that period of time when all of a sudden we're on the map and things were starting to move. So we go into this drought of 2011 through 13, and it was a bad one. But not only for us, that one was statewide. So we were challenged with, you know, we had the Mary Roads Pipeline, but we only had phase 1. We had not built the pipeline to Colorado River at Garwood. So the question was, at that time, and it was getting pretty darn serious, what do we do next? Do we build the second phase of Mary Roads Pipeline to the Colorado River, or do we look at groundwater resources in the area? And in my mind, it was Evangeline. There's a myth out there that we finally put to rest last week when we met with HDR and all the water people. Brian was there. The urban myth was groundwater at the Evangeline location was brackish and needed to be treated with RO treatment, and there was no capacity in the Mary Roads Pipeline. Both of them were false. I told the city staff this for the last 15 years that was false. Sinton drinks that water every day. It meets all primary and secondary drinking water standards. And when we designed the Mary Roads Pipeline, it was designed to get all of Texana, all of the Colorado River water, and about 25 million gallons a day of Gulf Coast aquifer water. And that could come from either Evangeline or a potential well field, which we call Goliad Sands, up in Refugio County. The Water District, when Jim was at the Water District, commissioned a study to look at groundwater at both those 2 locations and picked to move forward with the Goliad Sands project for a variety, mainly because they had their act together. The landowners had come together and said, hey, we're willing to do this. When they did test wells to prove the well field out, when it came time to go to the next phase of funding, and this was in the mid-2000s, again, we weren't growing, right? Jim turned it over to the city for funding for the next phase. Ron Massey was our public works director. Well, we weren't growing, and Ron just put it on the side of his desk and decided not to pursue it. So, not that it would have, we weren't trying to get out of a drought at the time. We were just managing our system. If you can take on customers with your existing infrastructure, you know, it helps you pay your water bills. You don't have to raise the rates every year, right? And when you're a city council like our council, you're elected every 2 years, nobody wants to raise water rates. Well, how do you build future water supplies if you're not willing to encumber additional debt to meet the demand for future water customers? So it's a difficult thing to manage your way through. Well, the decision at the time was either do we go do Evangeline or do we do Mary Roads Phase 2? Lloyd Neal and I used to laugh at each other driving back and forth to College Station. We looked at LaGrange at the Colorado River and there was no water in it. We were like, well, why would we build the pipeline to the Colorado River when Austin has senior rights to that water and it's run of the river water, and if there's no water in the river, you don't have anything to put in the pipeline, right? But the decision was to go build Mary Roads Phase 2 because this urban myth out there that water up in Sinton was no good. Well, I fought that battle, I lost. But we were going to do that at some point anyway. So it's good that it got done. It's what we're living off of today. Fortunately, the Hill Country had, you know, a horrific rain this summer and bought us a little bit of time there, but the Colorado River was in trouble. And over the last couple of years, Austin would send us a little love letter every once in a while and say, hey, just want you to know that, you know, in a pinch, you know, that maybe our water. Well, that was always the risk with building that to the Colorado River. James Dodson always thought that we would never build that section, that we would trade it for something else that we could build in our own backyard, whether that was a desal facility or a brackish groundwater project or something else. But we built it, and that's okay. Well, the drought started to let up. As a matter of fact, there were big floods all over the state of Texas during that 2014-15 timeframe. Our reservoirs never got much above 50% reservoir capacity, while all the other reservoirs in the state filled up. We never got really out of that drought. And what was beginning to happen is Steel Dynamics was, you know, Tommy Kurtz and the EDC was very active trying to market this region for industrial activity, creates jobs, wealth for the community, all the things that we know that it does. But we were managing a water system that was not adding enough supply to meet that demand. Most cities don't have to deal with what we deal with. 60% of our water every day is used by industry. So when you're managing a projected growth of your city, you can see the horizon pretty far out and plan for that. But when an industry comes in and needs 20 million gallons a day, that jumps, and that's hard to predict. And when's the next project come in and it jumps? That's hard to predict. Steel Dynamics was kicking around. The reason I drove Will Hawley to Sinton in my pickup truck to show him the Welder Ranch is because there was two water supplies, the Mary Roads Pipeline and the Evangeline Water, dual rail, access to deep water port, and a highway, and they picked that site. Now, they chose not to buy the Evangeline groundwater rights because the city of Corpus sold them water for $1.05, the published raw water rate, when the replacement cost for new water would have been much, much greater than that. So we have a water rate model that we're going to have to figure out moving forward, because as we get these big industries wanting to come here, are you going to pass the cost of that new water on to mom and dad living on Elm Street that didn't create that problem? Well, that's why cities have impact fees, right? Well, they do it for industry as well, and we're going to have to think about doing that. I'm not a rate modeler guy. That's a science all on its own, but we have to start addressing that issue. So Steel Dynamics came in. Gulf Coast Ventures was starting to kind of kick around. I got invited to go to Taiwan with a trade mission led by the Port of Corpus Christi and CCREDC. And the reason they brought me is because there was a rumor out around the world that you don't want to come to Corpus Christi with your business because they don't have water. So they asked me to go over there and make the pitch that we had water. Well, I knew darn well we didn't have enough water, but we could always make water. We could go get groundwater, and we could always use the Gulf of Mexico for desalination. And we didn't even touch brackish groundwater, right? So we could go make more water. So when we left on that trade mission, I had a letter from Margie Rose, our city manager, that said we had, in 2017, 90 million gallons a day of available water for new customers. When we were in Taiwan, we got a note that the LNRA pulled back 10 million gallons a day, or 10,000 acre-feet of water that was interruptible. It was interruptible water supply that was in our contract with the LNRA that they were going to keep in Jackson County for a future industry. Well, Formosa wanted it, and they had the right to get it. So while we were in Taiwan, we went down from 90 to 80. HDR had just completed the drought of record impact on our firm yield of our lake system. And it dropped our firm yield 30 million gallons a day. And the thing you got to keep in mind about reservoirs is they lose capacity every single day, either through evaporation or siltation. The most they'll ever hold is the day you build the dam and shut the gates. And from there on, it slowly starts to go down. So now we're, at 40 million gallons a day. Steel Dynamics needed 6 to 8 at the time. Gulf Coast Joint Ventures was asking for 25. Fortunately, they're not using anywhere near that. But their contract was going to be for 25 million gallons a day. Project Falcon, some of you all remember that. They wanted 40 million gallons a day. And so I write this on a napkin at lunch one day when we were John LaRue and Charlie Zahn and everybody, and I say, hey guys, hold on, we're selling water we don't have. And they're like, you're right, we don't have this water. But we're out there telling the world, come do business with us. So we weren't adding any supply. Well, during the drought of 2011, 13, get into 14, 15. In 2015, the desal guys, I met the Poseidon guys during the drought and went out to Carlsbad and looked at that facility that was just being built. And, you know, it's a pretty interesting facility. Certainly has helped them through their drought. But I asked the manager of the San Diego Water Authority, I said, why did you use a P3, a private developer, to develop that desal facility? And he said, look, it's real simple. Any elected official or water district manager in California that tried to do a desal project was either not reelected or fired. And we chose to offload that responsibility to the private sector and let them get it built, because that was the only way it was going to get built. And it's now the second largest desal facility in the country, about 50 million gallons a day. Tampa was the first big one. Santa Barbara was the first one, but it was so expensive to operate. When their drought was over, they turned it off. So I'm going to wrap it up here pretty quick. So the desal thing really started to take hold, and it was kind of funny. It was like sharks circling, you know, the dead body in the middle of the ocean. You know, there was a feast they could have. Todd Hunter had a big powwow down at the Ortiz Center where he invited all the vendors in the desal world to come, and everybody was just all excited about how this desal, because desal is, it's almost like a magic potion. Everybody wants it because you're looking at that ocean and you know darn well we're not going to run out of water if we can figure out how to make it fresh water. But again, it always comes down to cost. And so at that time, that was about 2015, 17, I won't go into the details, but Sean Strawbridge wanted to look at Harbor Island. He had me run the cost of a pipeline for 20 million gallons a day from Harbor Island to Brian Williams' facilities, Sampat Water District, The number was stupidly high. And I asked him, I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, that's none of your business. I just need you to run the cost of the pipeline to get this moved into the system. I said, well, you're not in the Region N. You don't qualify for SWIFT funding. He said, well, that's my problem. We're going to deal with that. So then began the desal wars, Corpus Christi versus the port, and we ended up wasting a whole bunch of time on that effort. We tore our community apart politically. It resulted in where we are today. That's unfortunate because we should have been better about making those decisions. We didn't go look at low-hanging fruit during those efforts. We were just solely focused on, well, people will say, oh, we looked at everything. Well, they kind of looked at everything, but if you bump the cost of groundwater so high that it looks like it's competitive with desal, then you go, whoa, desal is guaranteed, it's drought-proof. Well, okay, those urban myths got put to rest at City Hall last week. So today, the city moved forward with the purchase of the water rights from Evangeline. Still have a lot of work to do. Pape Dawson has been hired by the city to, and Hanson is working with Pape Dawson to get Evangeline moving and moving quickly. Our goal is to have water into the Mary Roads pipeline at the fence line by next November. You can produce 24 million gallons a day when it's ultimately built. We're hoping to get maybe 12 million gallons a day in the system. So where we are today, this region before drought restrictions was using about 130 to 140 million gallons a day on a peak summer day. Everybody can water their yard, industry can blow and go. With all the drought restrictions we've had, I think we're under 100 million gallons a day for the whole system right now. So that's helped. The Mary Roads pipeline, we had some long issues I won't go into on that, but the city had to better understand how to operate that pipeline because they thought it was falling apart, and it wasn't. They just weren't operating the 2 booster pump stations to move the water to Cal Allen. They were trying to push it from Lake Texana all the way to Owen Stevens treatment plant without operating the booster stations. Well, you can do that when your demand doesn't require you to have that much water. But if you're paying for the water in a take or pay and you're draining your reservoirs, you ought to be taking the water you're paying for and getting it in the pipeline. So start turning on the pump stations. And we're doing that now. And we're moving 70 million gallons a day. So we're short, right? Drew Molly came, I'm going to wrap this up real quick. Drew Molly came to my office last November, and he said, I want to run a wild idea by you. He said, what if we start just drilling wells along the Nueces River to get through this drought? And I said, Drew, we did that 40 years ago. He goes, what? I said, we did that 40 years ago. Well, fortunately, James Dodson had all of that information in Victoria, and he sent it to us, and we sat down with Drew and his staff and Peter and said, look, this is water for emergency purposes only. The water quality is brackish or slightly saline. TDS is above 1,000, sometimes well above it. Chlorides is too high. Industry won't like it. But to get through a drought, you can make it work. So they started drilling wells on the lower, what they call the east field. They've now moved up the river, which is where they really should have started focusing because that's where the better water quality is. They got a bed and banks permit for the first well field. They're applying for a bed and banks for the next. They think that they could get 28 million gallons a day of water, groundwater, into the Nueces River to help bridge this gap. We got 70 coming from points north. And by the way, Texana, I checked this morning, is at 76% capacity. Fills up fast, drops fast. It lost 25% capacity in the last 3 months because it hadn't rained. And we're going to get some rain. Hopefully it fills up in the spring, and we'll have that at least at 70. We'll have the emergency wells moving on Evangeline. And there's some other things that the city can talk to you about on reuse and some other things. Barney Davis, I think, is finally people are starting to understand the value of why are we not looking at Barney Davis. In the past, when Barney Davis was looked at, you had a private entity that ran the plant, owned the plant, ran the plant, And you would have to marry that up with the interest of a municipality. Now, that's kind of tricky. Well, this past year, well, the last 2 years, CPS Energy, which is San Antonio, bought that power plant. So now we have an opportunity to marry up two big, large Texas cities that could look at a large-scale desal facility. And if I was king for the day, I'd go do Evangeline, I'd do some wastewater reuse, you've got your emergency wells when you need them, you do Barney Davis, and we're done for a good long while. So I'll end it with that. That's how we got to where we are today. And the good news is the council acted today to go get that Evangeline water.
Questions?